Today, we have a story about what is now considered one of the most successful hoaxes in history. But was it really a hoax? Or was it just a harmless joke that had caught fire and spread uncontrollably? When the most brilliant minds in England poured around the gasoline of spiritualism. Hi, I'm Heidi from the Obsession Podcast, and today I'm going to tell you the tale of the Cottingley Fairies. And I might even be inspired to draw something on my tablet. And if you want to draw something with me, please do, and please send it in. I would love to see it. This story begins in 1917 with a 9-year-old girl called Frances Griffiths, who was in trouble yet again for playing in the beck, which is a kind of stream near the family home, and for getting her shoes and her dress wet. Frances was distressed. The house she lived in Cottingley, on the outskirts of Bradford, Yorkshire, had been in turmoil, and the family was on the brink of an implosion. Something as simple as wet shoes could cause problems. Frances had only recently moved to England with her mother and father from Cape Town in South Africa. Her father had been called up to fight in the Boer War, and it had been decided that she and her mother would stay with her aunt, uncle, and her cousin Elsie in Yorkshire. The Griffith family was used to living in a mansion with servants, and the small working-class cottage in Cottingley was quite a lifestyle change for them. Cottingley, however, did have a meadow and a stream that looked like something out of a fairy tale, and Frances would spend hours there, playing and making up stories. It was there that she could escape from the disapproval of her uncle, Arthur Wright, who was not happy about the overcrowded house. And she could also forget her worries about her father fighting in a war so far away. So, there she was on this particular day in 1917, being confronted by her family about her wet shoes and dress and her insistence on playing near the water. It was then that Frances uttered the words that were to completely derail her life and the life of so many others. I go to see the fairies. And the adults expected in the way you'd expect adults in those times to react. Well, of course, they told her off for having an imagination. But then her 16-year-old cousin Elsie spoke up and said that Frances was telling the truth, and that she, Elsie, who I'm drawing right now, had also seen the fairies. Now, Elsie, at 16, was already working, and she must have seemed very grown up to Frances. Although she wasn't an academic, Elsie was highly artistic and had a great mechanical intelligence. Frances was flattered that such an impressive big cousin was taking her side. Despite sharing a bedroom, Frances and Elsie had never had a great deal to do with each other. Elsie was not only a teenager, she was busy working as a photographer's assistant, mainly retouching photos, which will come up later. Skilled at drawing, Elsie sometimes made copies of illustrations in Frances's storybooks, and she was particularly good at drawing fairies. Elsie asked her father, who was a keen amateur photographer, if she could borrow his camera so that she and her little cousin could provide them with evidence of the said fairies. Well, Arthur Wright was not enthusiastic about this idea. Cameras were complicated and expensive tools back then. But he did end up relenting. And soon, Elsie and Francis were traipsing around the meadow with the 1/4-inch midge camera. When they returned home, they begged Arthur to develop their film immediately. The first photo that was developed was the most famous one, and it shows Francis with the beck behind her and a cloud of dancing fairies in front of her, and most people have seen this photo. But Arthur was not taken in, and he was absolutely not impressed. He was even less impressed a month later when the second most famous of the photos was taken, the one of his daughter, Elsie, holding the hand of a tiny goblin man. Well, he forbade the girls from using his camera again, and the 2 pictures went straight into the drawer. Angry about being deceived, the parents hunted around the girls' room and around the stream looking for the fairy cutouts that the girls had used. They found nothing, and before long, the incident was forgotten. So, 3 years later, in 1920, Polly and Annie, the mothers of Elsie and Francis, became very active members of the Theosophical Society, a spiritual movement that combined mysticism and metaphysics and was quite fashionable at the time. One evening, they went to a seminar about fairies, and Polly casually mentioned the 2 photographs taken by her daughter and her niece. Of course, this sparked the interest of the members present, and Polly brought the photos to the next meeting. The members were incredibly excited and had absolutely no doubt that the fairies in these photographs were completely real, and that Elsie and Francis were able to communicate with supernatural beings. Now, these days, it might seem impossible that these photos, while very beautiful and artistic, should convince anyone when they are just so obviously paper cutouts. But we have to understand the mentality of the time. For a more in-depth analysis on how people of this era viewed photography and children and how they were so easily tricked, go to Obsession Podcast, where Becky and myself will talk it over in a lot more detail. So, now, this is where we introduce Edward Gardner, who is a prominent member of the Theosophical Society and a celebrated writer and lecturer. He was so excited about these photographs that he asked to borrow the glass plate negatives, and he took them to a photography expert called Harold Snelling. Now, Snelling concluded that the photographs were not fakes, and by not fakes, what he meant were that they were single exposure shots and they hadn't been doctored, and they were straightforward photographs of whatever had been in front of the camera at the time, which honestly they were. So the photos were cleaned up and prints were made, and Gardner spread the photos around. Basically, they went viral. Really, really viral. A modern day equivalent might be the photoshopping competition that produced the Slender Man character. Something on that level. So Elsie and Francis were now 3 years older than they had been when the first photographs had been taken. And, well, the media attention threw their world into sudden disarray. A prank that they played on their family when they were younger was now being talked about and discussed all over the country. Now, we get to one of the most famous people in the story, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes and a passionate believer in fairies. Conan Doyle was a very complex person, both a pragmatic intellectual and a deeply spiritual man. And this contradiction, honestly, wasn't that unusual post-World War I, as the death of so many people had led to a spiritual renaissance, hence the popularity of communities such as the Theosophical Society. So, when Conan Doyle heard about these photographs, he was desperate for them to be real. So, he decided to go to Cottingley to gather more evidence. So he arrived at Cottingley with Gardner, and he provided the girls with his own camera and his own glass plates. And we can only imagine how stressed out this would have been for Francis and Elsie, whose lives had now been completely engulfed with their childhood prank. Now, they told Gardner that the fairies wouldn't appear with the adults hanging around, which was pretty smart of them, and he agreed to stay out of their way. The final 3 photos were taken that day, and the girls were determined that they would be the last, going so far as to say that the fairies didn't like them as much now that they were almost grown up. So, the photos were published by Strand magazine, accompanied by an article by Conan Doyle, and the girls became quite famous. There were, of course, plenty of skeptics out there, like there always are, and plenty of people ready to drag the reputations of Conan Doyle and Edward Gardner into the mud. The 2 girls now had to keep up the charade for the sake of the people who had risked their careers over the photographs. And this was a heavy responsibility. Detractors started to finally notice the similarity between the Cottingley Fairies and the illustration in the most popular children's book of the day. Francis and Elsie were being looked upon as fraudsters. Conan Doyle doubled down, and his book, The Coming of the Fairies, which had Elsie on the cover, was published in 1922. Well, the media lost interest eventually, and slowly, Elsie and Francis were able to go on with their lives. They both got married, they had children, and they spent time living abroad. But they never truly freed themselves from their hoaxer reputations. When media interest resurfaced in the 1960s and 70s, Francis and Elsie were always evasive in their answers. It wasn't until the 80s that they fully admitted that the first 4 photos were fake, but they insisted that the 5th was entirely real. Frances also insisted until her death that although the fairies in the photographs were not real, there were actual fairies at the beck in Cottingley, and she had seen them many times. Personally, it makes me happy to believe this. Sometimes we need magic in a world that's making less and less sense. So for me, if the story has a moral, and not every story has to have a moral, it's don't believe everything you hear, don't believe everything you see, but believe in the things that bring you glimmers of joy in dark times. So, I'm going to finish up this picture and I'll post it up for you. And thank you for joining me. Subscribe for more amazing true stories, and please check out the podcast Obsession on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Stay magical. Bye.